a young.
The before.
A flashback.
After his visit to the Jackson family surgeon. Us? No, there's nothing in here till like 2, I think it is.
Work done.
Okay, that's whenever you're ready.
In light of our interview yesterday with Thomas Sutherland and your all's appearance this morning, and you were telling me that last weekend you were all in Washington for
Yes.
the reunion and memorial for the 3 hostages who died. And you were saying it's a time for closure.
Yes.
During that time together, was that a commonality that you shared, that it is time to put the hostage experience behind you and move on to a different part of your lives?
Yes, I think it was already beginning to happen, and we were recognizing that in our conversation. There was in conversation reference back to former times and what it was like, and the separation of families and the uncertainties and the fears and the pain, but also to the extent to which people are now having to find themselves in vocation, in employment, in responsibility, in making some moves, and in recognizing that those times of separation and captivity are now behind us, and it's become part of our lives, not only individually, but I think corporately. We recognize that, but that it is also behind. It's a kind of a launching pad now into the future, and that doesn't mean it's easy. Some are still looking for work and employment, but facing it with hope and knowing that they have resources that will see them through. I think that was very important, and a sense of trust and faith in God, that the future is in God's hands, and we can trust God.
Do you sense from the other hostages, did you experience any sort of resentment toward the United States, that you were left in that situation? Was it, or do most of the hostages just figure that it was circumstantial and there was really no control over whether or not they were taken captive? Did they have to work through any kind of this resentment that, why me? Why wasn't my country there to get me out? Where am I now? And have to work myself back into society again in my niche and reestablish my family connections?
I don't remember hearing that kind of resentment. I have before, and I'm certain it is still present with at least 1 or 2 persons who feel that they were neglected, not much was done. But I think rather just a recognition that in fact the hostage and hostage families were pretty much on their own, that the period of waiting was very hard to pass through, to be both patient and creative with. In other words, trying to do something but not knowing if those efforts really made any difference or not. That was very frustrating. But over and beyond that, most of what I heard repeatedly from various people was, we want to help to break the cycle of violence, and it must really stop with us. We're not asking for retribution or revenge or trying to see that something is done to punish the hostage takers. Rather, we feel we have to be pretty much out front of saying that we don't want this to happen again. We don't want to contribute to the cycle of violence, and we hope that fundamental issues can be addressed so that people who are unemployed, whose homes have been destroyed, who are scattered and from their families, that they will not be subject to extremist groups that try to recruit young men for taking hostages. That those fundamental issues of peace in the Middle East really have to be addressed, and the United States has a big responsibility
Mm-hmm.
trying to contribute toward moderation rather than extremism in the Middle East. This is what I was hearing.
In your teachings at San Francisco, seminary in San Francisco, tell me you're a chair there in mission and evangelism.
Yes.
And you're concentrating on a global perspective.
On theological education, yes.
And certainly you must have a better appreciation for that.
Yes,
now.
I should say.
What are you finding from students that you teach? Do they sense that they have an opportunity to address issues like the Middle East or to have some kind of effect on governments and powers that be?
I don't know about directly affecting such issues. We do on our campus, for example, have a group known as Circle of Refuge, and they do try to speak to U.S. policy on Central America. And we have occasions of trying to address U.S. policy in the Middle East, but that's not really our major effort. Rather, in our programs, we are trying to help students appreciate the importance of being aware what issues are of the church and society outside the United States, and how we in the United States are related to those issues. First of all, for example, we have now for a third time had a semester-long class of looking into issues of U.S.-Mexican relationships in relationship to the church's mission in Mexico, the role of indigenous churches in Mexico, and then we spent 10 days, a good part of it, with extremely poor families in Mexico, and asking ourselves, how is the U.S.-Mexican relationship affecting those people? Then we returned and had a fiesta on our campus for the rest of the community, in which students had an opportunity to explain something of what they had experienced, some of the questions that had arisen with them, and how it has shaped their thinking about ministry in the United States. One very important part of our program is being aware, especially on the West Coast, of the racial ethnic diversity within our own population, and the fact that within a few years Anglos will be a minority in the population on the West Coast. And asking ourselves then, what does that have to do with mission in any situation? And how can we try to be agents for educating people in our own congregations and in our communities about the importance of seeing not only close at hand what we're doing, but trying to see that in a much wider context. That's what we mean by a global perspective on theological education. We don't have to go a long distance, though sometimes we do, to ask about third world issues, but actually they're right with us here in the United States, among the people that we see on the street or meet in our communities, and we have to be prepared to understand and to address some of those issues.
The multicultural concerns are ever present, I think, among the denominations. And what do you see as what efforts do you see that the church needs to make in order to become multicultural and not simply to ask other cultures to assimilate into what is known as the denominations or as the church? How does the church go about that?
Well, of course, there are ways in which more and more there is interaction. For example, we now have a program in Southern California in which there are now well over 135 students enrolled. Many of them come from different racial ethnic backgrounds, and this program is serving Hanmi Presbytery, which is a Korean presbytery of about 200 churches, as well as related to Hispanic ministry and to other aspects. We therefore, I think a part of the church's response is education, being aware that we cannot really legitimately any longer live within an Anglo-white middle-class context, but really need to hear the questions and contributions people bring from other perspectives that help us to see other aspects of the gospel we have not seen before. And secondly, already, of course, there's a great deal happening in most places where Presbyterian churches are in terms of trying to meet the issues, the community issues of people of other backgrounds, among the homeless, in terms of projects in the inner city, a whole range of things. And thirdly, I think also we have to look at the priorities, the social priorities of our own country, especially as it has to do with people coming from other cultural contexts, and to say really what is happening with them and how can they contribute toward the life of the church. I think we are not really in most of our congregations yet very hospitable toward people of other cultures. We really like people who are like ourselves, and we're not really very open to the newcomer. I think we have to find ways in which we can appreciate people for who they are, take time to listen to them, allow them to raise their questions and issues, and to make changes ourselves. In some sense, we ourselves have to undergo a great deal of change, I believe. We find that's happening with our students every time we go to Indonesia or to Central America or to Cuba. The most important thing is what happens with us when we reflect on the experience of interacting with other people and receiving the gifts they have to give to us.
So you see, as in evangelism, the concern must also be that not only a respect for other cultures, but the inclusion to that culture.
Yes, of course, certainly. And for example, when we teach a course called Third World at Our Doorstep, in Northern California, we have a great variety of people of many different cultural backgrounds. Among them are a large number of Native Americans. We have one of the largest concentrations in the United States in the San Francisco Bay Area, but to a large extent they're invisible. We make it a point to visit, to hear from people in an ecumenical ministry among Native Americans in Oakland, and to find that approaches they take in speaking to people of Native American background is really very different than it would be in talking with people of Anglo background, and that we need to recognize that there is freedom for whole different kinds of expressions that also help to illuminate the gospel for all of us.
The one that comes to mind is the most recent, the sage welcoming ceremony.
Yes,
Worship
yes,
service.
yes. That would be very.
The National Office of Louisville got a lot of calls from people saying, this is paganism. You need to read Leviticus. Does that frustrate you that we still can't get beyond the mindsets that we have sometimes?
Well, I know there are questions raised, and I think there ought to be questions raised, but I think there's some very good answers. I found that to be very meaningful, and I was glad to see it. And I think it's a recognition that other people have their traditions which are very meaningful within the Christian context. I didn't regard that as all pagan. I thought it was really set in a gospel context.
In your teachings, do you examine the dialogues that the Christians have with other faith groups throughout the world?
Yes, of course, of course.
What are you hearing from students in such studies like that?
Usually,
People more open.
yes. For example, last fall I was teaching a semester-long course on Christian-Muslim relations, and taking a good deal of time for us to hear from Muslims, to find out something about the very rich 1,400 years of experience of Islam. And the first response of students was, wow, I didn't know all that. was part of that history. And secondly, learning something about the history of interaction of Christians and Muslims, which as sometimes has been very good and many times has been very painful, that we as Christians have separated ourselves into a Christendom which we felt was threatened from the outside. And that now today, for example, in Richmond, California, where there is a very large black Native and Afro-American community and a very large number of Muslims, there's very active cooperation between the Afro-American Presbyterian congregation and people in that community to try to meet needs of housing and needs of youth in that community. That there are ways we can cooperate and we don't lose our identity. In fact, it very much strengthens our sense of Christian identity.
There's an issue brought before this General Assembly that suggests that Presbyterians, the staff, and members of the congregation donate a day's pay toward helping rebuild South Central Los Angeles.
Oh, yes.
Do you see that important as vital that members of this denomination do more than pay lip service to bridging the gaps that we experience between cultural groups and racial groups?
Yes, and I must say I was greatly heartened by what Jim Brown, the pastor at St. Peter's by the Sea, had to say about the response of that congregation to work with the Olive Street congregation in downtown Los Angeles in a cooperative effort to try to meet community needs following the events there, and not only to meet the needs of people who were in need of food and homeless, but to really try to address some of the fundamental ongoing issues of that large city. I think that's really what we have to address ourselves to. As a society, I think we have really failed to meet a lot of the primary priorities that need to have attention. And so when we say, as Reformed Christians, we are concerned not only for our own spiritual welfare, the spiritual growth and nurture of congregations, but really for expressing in the social context what we believe God's intention is for our cities and our communities. I think that's extremely important, and I think is a very important witness of the gospel. I must say, out of my experience in Lebanon, of the 10 years of terrible warfare there, again and again we could see, and it was often discussed by Lebanese, of the fundamental issues really that were not addressed for 20 years that finally led to a social explosion. And I very much think we need to give much more attention to that in the United States, or we will have failed.
It seems as when we don't, do we need to move, AJ?
No, it's okay.
It appears that when we don't address the major cultural differences that we have, that
Fundamental economic and social issues, sure.
tend to hunker down into their own.
Well, and people become hopeless. They don't believe that there's anything beyond today, that, you know, to survive today is the essential issue, and nothing lies beyond it. That is a very dangerous situation to get to.
And I wondered, it seems to me that it should be quite apparent to denominations that in order to do evangelism, they must show that their churches are open to all cultures and all people, because it seems like in today's society, we do not have the nuclear family, and I think that we do a lot of discrimination, or maybe insensitive to people who are experiencing a different kind of family situation.
Yes.
Parental-child relationship.
Yes.
That the church has not been sensitive to.
Yes.
Needs.
Yes.
Do you see that this mission work and bridging gaps between racial groups, between cultural groups, as part of that evangelism for us?
Yes, of course. And what we have experienced repeatedly in Mexico is that, as well as in other parts of Latin America, that basic Christian communities are groups of people really reading the Bible in a new light and saying, this is a message for us and for today, and that God empowers us to try to address the social realities we face and to do something about it. I think evangelism takes place in that very process. I don't think it's the only way, but I think it's one way in which people come to understand that God's message in Christ is for us now, and is calling us toward trying to really address the actual life that people are experiencing day by day. I don't think to do that is in some way kind of a gimmick for then an evangelistic approach. I think in the very process evangelism is taking place. And much of the evangelism has to be with us, that we are learning something new about the gospel ourselves and being thereby transformed.
And finally realizing that the church does not answer your problems or your questions, but allows questions.
Yes,
That's,
and often raises new questions. Sure.
That's the wonderful thing about it.
Yes.
That you're allowed to have these questions.
That's right.
And these different points of view.
Yes.
Not everyone in the denomination feels that way, but
Yes.
Thank you so much for talking.
You're quite welcome.
It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
It's been my pleasure.
Just
Sit
stay where
tight.
you are, and we're just going to get a couple cutaways. Dee, I'll let you get yours first,
Okay,
then I'll get
good.
mine.
Over his
I
shoulder.
think that people of the younger age, this church and a lot of
I
other
saw,
denominations see the baby boomers as their group that they target for evangelism. And I think that demographic is very wise to whether or not the church is being
Get a little lens flare, Arnie.
and really
Slide the
including
light
them.
back just a wee
There's some
bit.
churches that do not think of single parent households.
They get it?
and single
Oh, they got
Yes.
it. And kill
That's
that
right.
9 behind
I
me.
was encouraged this morning with the breakfast that was sponsored by Mariners as well as Presbyterian men.
got
That
Hey,
I was not aware that
this
they
thing's
were
out.
also giving
And I'm gonna
attention
move
to
the light.
single
I still got a little
parents, which they regard as part, of the total family picture. Because some years ago, that was kind of, well, it was either not discussed or was considered a separate group. They weren't really families. Of course, somewhere around a third of American families are in fact single-parent families. And it's a reality of our day.
Yeah, that's a ministry and a mission in itself.
Of course it is.
It's we have a tendency, I think, to overlook the people who are closest to us sometimes. And,
On the shoulder.
I wondered how you felt about denominations taking an obvious stand on things like the way we're treating the Haitian refugees, the way the Bush administration
Move that mic some more. Let's see, go.
returning
That got it.
them to
That
their
got
own
it.
country, that, there was some peril.
Okay, Arnie, I got enough.
denomination-
That grows out of that. Not knowing
Pull the
what's
camera itself
happening to
back.
close relatives. How will people survive the brutality that people are experiencing day by day in Haiti? It certainly appears that the U.S. policy is U.S. action. I mean, there are some sympathetic words, but I think the action is really quite severe. And of course, it's been called into question by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as to whether it really is a legitimate action at this time. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of serious questions.
I think the call to action on the LA thing, asking Presbyterians to actually do something in their own life,
Yes.
that brings that to mind.
Yes, yes,
Which is so critical.
it certainly
It's
is.
very easy to sit
That's right.
and say, yes,
Sure.
I feel for you.
Yeah,
I understand the situation. It is when you like it.
yeah.
And go about your own life. And forget the
Sure.
Americans.
I experienced that in Lebanon, myself, as war really became very brutal. The first question was, for many people, are we going to stay or are we going to go? And early Carol and I made a decision we're going to stay. And then the next question is, well, why am I here? Is it just to be doing the ordinary thing? And I found in helping to enable people to really, in a face-to-face way, do something to deal with, to relate to people who were out in the street because of warfare, really made a change in the whole relationship and the perception of what the reality was. It didn't make it easier, but I think it's that kind of interaction, that personal interaction, that really comes home to people, and able to begin to see the larger issues of what is taking place and how there's responsibility to try to address the larger issues. You're very welcome.
Starting with me.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to start with you too.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Possibly send you a